Welcome, everyone. We'll be giving attendees a few minutes to join. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Morgan Pagels, and I'm the Director of Business Development for Maryland Addiction Recovery Center. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the topic, Bridging the Gap, an Integrative Understanding of Substance Use Disorders and Family System Recovery. As a reminder, we'll be conducting this session in webinar format, meaning all participant microphones will be muted. We won't be able to see you or hear you. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Additionally, the slides and recording of the webinar will be emailed to you within 14 days of the program to the email that you registered with. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. We would like to thank our educational partner, CE Learning Systems, for assisting in providing these credits through co-sponsorship with the American Psychological Association. Please note that in order to receive your credits, you will need to be on for the entirety of the program and complete the post-webinar evaluation. A link will be emailed to you directly after the presentation from cego.com. After finishing the evaluation, you will have immediate access to your certificate of completion. Today, I'm proud to introduce our presenter, Alex Ribbentrop. Alex Ribbentrop is a psychotherapist and founder of Live Free Psychotherapy, a private group practice specializing in comprehensive outpatient care and licensed in Virginia, Maryland, and Florida. Alex is the family consultant for the Encore Outpatient Clinical Team, a qualified supervisor, EMDR trained clinician, and certified in the treatment of complex trauma and family systems. He is also a 2-time recipient of George Mason University's Outstanding Master of Social Work Award. Alex's career and training has focused on the areas of complex trauma, family systems, personality, and substance use disorders. His approach integrates trauma-informed practice and existential theory to support individuals in the development of personal meaning and value in their lives. In addition to clinical practice, Alex works as a clinical consultant and has most recently developed a program that provides more comprehensive assessment and treatment options for family systems at the outpatient level of care. I will now hand the presentation over to Alex to get us started. Thank you again for joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Morgan, and thank you again to Encore and Mark and Karen for inviting me and allowing me to present today. Thank you as well to everybody that's made it out for the presentation. Let's see, to get us started, we have a little review of the learning objectives that can be touched on here, but if possible, we can head to the next slide and then just kind of dive right in. So to start us off, what do we mean by integrative understanding? And so for our purposes, when considering substance use disorders, we want to view integrative as a way of understanding substance use as a presenting issue that's the result of multiple compounding factors. These factors are occurring over time. Many of these factors are especially connected to considerations related to the family system. Today's presentation is going to draw on a variety of theories and models to support us in developing an integrative understanding. Each of these are enormous topics in and of themselves. And so today, my hope is to provide an overview of elements that may be most helpful in supporting our understanding of where substance use disorders emerge from, and then how to use this understanding to support treatment and recovery efforts. Some of the primary factors that we're going to consider and we're going to touch on as we move through the presentation are going to include genetics, neurobiology, especially related to stress and trauma, personality development, and family system considerations. Through this effort, again, I hope to highlight the importance of family system work and family system engagement as beneficial to the recovery process and overall treatment efforts. So again, why is this integrative effort important? The graphs on the screen represent overdose deaths between the years of 1999 and 2019. This is data that came out relatively recently, I believe, from studies done by the CDC and National Institute on Drug Abuse. And when we look at these charts, a lot of deserved attention has been given to the opioid epidemic as a way of explaining these numbers. And obviously, there's a lot to be said for that, including the role of irresponsible prescription and pharmaceutical practices. So while these overdose rates are certainly connected to these factors, it does not give us a full picture. This way of explaining is also indicative of a pattern of seeking single factor ways of explaining complex issues. Next slide. So if we look beyond the single factor way of explaining a complex issue, and we look a little bit more, we look more deeply at some of the data involved here, we see something interesting. So between 2006 and 2012, there was a steady increase in overall opioid dispensing rate. The number of prescriptions dispensed peaked in 2012. And so correspondingly, when we look at the data, we see a continued increase in overdose deaths over that 6-year period of time. What's interesting is that the overall national dispensing rate declined from 2012 to 2020. And in 2020, the rate was the lowest it had been in 15 years. And so despite that, despite prescription numbers dropping to their lowest in 20 years, we still see the highest rates of overdose death in a 20-year span. And this is in conjunction with a steady increase in a supply-demand effect of fentanyl. So looking beyond the prescription considerations, these numbers highlight not only poor practices in pharmaceuticals and prescription drugs, it highlights a susceptibility and a vulnerability to a large number of the population developing substance use or dependency issues. So while we have more treatment options, we have more resources, and we have more understanding than ever before, this data is a harsh reality. As difficult as it is to see these numbers, improvement is readily available, and it's available by continuing to move away from some of the overly reductive or single factor efforts to understand complex issues like substance use, and applying a lot of what we already know about contributing factors to substance use disorders so that we can develop more individually tailored and informed care. We can go to the next slide. So let's review some of what we know, and we can begin this effort with what is referred to as the biopsychosocial model. This model or framework was developed in 1977, by researchers at the University of Rochester. And the model was developed as an effort to advance upon the work and views of a more traditional biomedical model. Biomedical model is something that has been around for a long time. It's been very effective in many ways. Again, an issue there is that it's hindered by this reductive approach Additionally, the biomedical model is rooted in a tradition of mind-body duality, or that the mind and body are separate and distinct entities. And this is an idea that has been around for, let's say, 2,000 years, but it's still incredibly impactful around how we study and how we provide healthcare today. The diagrams illustrate the use of this biopsychosocial model, and the approach, again, it's in contrast to that single factor disease model. Examples of that single factor effort to understand complex issues are things like trying to understand violent behavior by associating it with the expression of a single gene. Another example is something like attempting to explain depression or depressive symptoms via chemical imbalance alone. This biopsychosocial model attempts to gather a lot of information and then synthesize it in a way that informs more comprehensive care. To help us dive further into our integrative efforts, we can move on to the next slide and take a look at some genetic considerations. A popular description and way of attempting to understand substance use issues and substance use disorders is by talking about a genetic predisposition. So essentially what we know at this point is that there is not a one-to-one substance use disorder genetic link. What we do see and what research indicates is that a general tendency for substance and behavioral patterns of dependence may be transmitted via genes. So evidence indicates currently that individuals are frequently dependent on multiple substances or patterns of behavior. This finding requires us to consider that there's the possibility of a general dependent tendency being transmitted. Findings do not account for vulnerability to specific objects of dependence. Genetics account for a general and increased risk of SUDS. So we have this generalized consideration and acknowledgement that there's a correlation, but there's not clarity on a one-to-one corresponding factor. So again, this substance use only focus or perspective calls us to consider additional factors and variables that are contributing to the above noted tendency. It's not just a predisposition to substance use or a pattern of behavior. There's something deeper to consider. And a primary consideration around this topic is related to how we cope with and are impacted by exposure to and the experience of stress. This brings us into a topic and a consideration of not only genetics, but also epigenetics. This is the degree to which direct experience can alter the way that certain genes are expressed over the course of a lifetime and how some of those changes can be potentially transmitted to other generations. Related to that, a very interesting study that's gotten it's very popular and cited widely, but it's helpful in terms of where we're going to go with some of this presentation. And the study's from 2013. And the study, to outline this study, it involved male mice. And so these male mice were trained to fear the smell of a chemical that was similar to the smell of cherries and almonds. So what happened is that they would take these mice, they would expose them to the smell. At the same time, they would expose these mice to a mild electric shock. Eventually, the smell was associated with the shock. And so over time, with this association, the exposed mice would begin to shake out of stress when exposed to the smell alone. So the smell alone would elicit the stress response. What the researchers found is that this stress reaction experienced by these male mice was passed down not one, but 2 generations. So the offspring of these male mice had a similar stress response to the smell, despite having never encountered the smell at any time previously. Again, this response was passed down for 2 generations. It was also present in mice conceived via in vitro fertilization. Not only was there this example of potential epigenetic change and heredity in response to a stress exposure and a survival response, what they also saw was that these changes were paired with changes to brain structure, especially brain structure that processes odors. Those mice sensitized to the smell and their descendants had more neurons that produce a protein known to detect the odor compared with control mice and their offspring. Further, structures that receive signals from the scent detecting neurons and send those signals to other parts of the brain, such as those involved in processing fear, were also bigger. So what we have here is a hypothesis that epigenetic alterations based on direct experience can play a role in human development and adaptation. This also highlights the degree to which experience and adaptation to experience can be intergenerational in nature. We're going to come back to this. So what do we make of this? A couple key takeaways in terms of genetics. Number one, there's a lot to be determined. We're fortunate to be in a place and in a time where technological advancement is increasing exponentially. We are going to see more and more work and evidence around the ideas of genetics and brain and nervous system science. It's going to be tremendously helpful. It's a huge positive. However, at this point, there's a lot to be determined. Number two, what we can really take away from this, or what I like to take away from this, is that the mice in the smell study indicates how impactful experiences related to stress and survival can be. Okay, so this brings us into some of our further considerations, but we want to be aware of this, the importance of the stress response primarily at this point. We can move into the next slide. We're talking about stress. It tends to take us into a conversation around trauma. And trauma is a huge topic today. It has appropriately gained a lot of recognition and a lot of focus, and is a valued topic in the field. I think at this point, there's so much to be said for it that it's hard to know exactly what we mean sometimes when we're talking about trauma. To understand what we mean by trauma, we want to take a look at neurobiological factors and, again, considerations around stress. A couple of these charts reinforce the interconnected nature of experience, brain-body connection, and our nervous system as well. So stress is a normal part of life. Depending on biopsychosocial variables that we're going through some today, we're going to respond and adapt to stress in any variety of ways. However, in general, stress activates our survival response systems. Many of us are familiar with the idea of fight or flight. This idea was developed in 1915 by a person named Dr. Walter Cannon. He was interested in better understanding what happened when we were exposed to stress. And what he found is that this fight-flight mechanism, the name that he coined, revolves around the discharging of our sympathetic nervous system and how that works with our endocrine system. In our bodies, we have an autonomic nervous system. It's made up of two primary branches. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system is associated broadly with the functions of rest and digest. The autonomic nervous system is associated with things that are happening outside of our conscious control, recognition, etc., which is important. So Dr. Cannon found that the fight or flight had to do with the sympathetic system and the endocrine system, and how these systems interconnected and worked together in our brain and our body. What he found as well is that stress is less about an acute experience, and stress is more about the process of assessing our environment and our experience. And when we're in the process of assessing our environment, these fight or flight survival mechanisms kick in. So in the process of assessment, we begin to experience an increased heart rate, increased respiration, increased constriction of blood vessels in our extremities, so that more blood and oxygen is available to our core and to our brain. We also see that digestive functions are turned off, immune functions are turned off, and reproductive function is decreased as well. Teaming up with the sympathetic operation, we have the endocrine system that's helping and supporting this process. And the adrenal glands produce adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these are hormones that help to communicate and support the sympathetic response. In addition to the adrenaline, we have cortisol, commonly known as a stress hormone. And cortisol helps to distribute energy through our body and also suppress immune function. In addition to fight or flight, research has found more recently, as of 2000, some research done by Dr. Shelley Taylor has indicated we have access to other survival mechanisms. And one of these is the idea of tending and befriending, or the affiliative response. And what Dr. Taylor found was that in response to stress, sometimes we would engage in this fight or flight process, fight, flight, freeze. And we'll also take a look at fawning. Not only would we engage in these processes, but we would also potentially engage in the affiliative response. And that's the idea of coming together with other people for support. And what she found was that when we did this, the hormone oxytocin, which is associated with pair bonding, was released and was effective in moderating stress response. As noted, stress is not the acute experience. Stress is the surveying of our experience. And it can be broken down into three different phases. One would be the alarm phase, two, the resistance phase, and three, the exhaustion phase. What we see is that if a person or an animal spends too much time in any one or all or some of these phases, damage will occur. An example of damage that occurs by staying in a prolonged stress response state is our brain's exposure to cortisol. We know that high levels of cortisol results in atrophy to neurons in our brain, and areas of our brain that are especially susceptible to cortisol exposure are the frontal lobe and the hypothalamus. The frontal lobe has to do with higher order reasoning, learning, problem solving, planning. The hippocampus we know to be important and associated with learning and memory. So these parts of the brain, when exposed to cortisol, as a result of prolonged stress exposure are damaged. Some of this damage results in things like decreased production and ability to receive chemicals like serotonin. And that's one way of attempting to understand elements of a depressive presentation. So it's a good example, though, of it's not just a chemical imbalance, right? The chemical imbalance might be the end result that triggers a change, but that end result is part of a chain of events that could have been going on for a very, very, very long time. And if we don't understand that chain of events or attempt to potentially change some of that chain, and we only focus on the chemical imbalance, then we're chipping away at a problem, but the things that contributed to the problem continue to occur. We're fighting an uphill battle. That happens a lot in the substance use recovery field. Additionally, what we see are emotional correlations between survival and stress response. So this is anecdotal, and if we think about it, we see it clearly, but things like a fight response associated with emotions like anger. A flight response is associated with feelings like anxiety. A freeze response is associated with detachment or depressive symptoms, and person goes inward. Those with heightened exposure to stress, inadequate access to coping strategies and resources will learn to survive by over-relying on the use of one or two forms of defense mechanism. We can go to the next slide. This slide is an example of 4 commonly referred to defense structures: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And again, what we see is that overexposure to stress and or difficulty in coping and navigating stress will result in trending toward one or a couple of these responses. What occurs there is the over-reliance on the coping structure, the coping mechanism, ultimately limits our ability to access other coping strategies. So it limits our ability to be flexible in our assessment and response to stress. This then impairs our ability to relax into an undefended state, and it creates a very narrow way of operating and navigating our lives. So at this point, if we combine genetic and neurobiological considerations, we observe patterns that emerge in our nervous system function. And these patterns inform how both unconscious and conscious parts of ourselves develop. We can go to the next slide. Neurocircuitry and personalities related to, patterns related to personality development may be seen as analogous to something like the Grand Canyon or a river cutting a route through rock. Over time and with repetition, these patterns grow deeper. And interestingly, for me at least, the images that we have of neurons, axons, dendrites, et cetera, are shockingly similar to the structure of a riverbed. I'm not smart enough to know if there's any actual connection, but it's interesting. So, as noted, personality corresponds with the neurobiology of the stress response. And why is this such an issue? You can go to the next slide. Hands down, the leading stressor, root of trauma, etc., for people is other people. So whether this is acute abuse, or implicit patterns related to family of origin, complex trauma, poor coping strategies, or a combination of these factors. Our biggest stressor is navigating the world with other humans. In a perfect world, we learn enough in our family of origin to move into adolescence and adulthood with a relatively flexible personality structure. So we can assess when we're stressed, we can assess our experience and our environment. And if we need to fight or be assertive, we can engage in that process. If we need to respond to an anxiety or a fear and disengage, we're able to do that. If we need to pause or freeze when continued action seems to be counterproductive, we're able to do that. If it seems to be of benefit to engage with others and to work as part of a collective, collaborate, connect with others, we're able to do that. And we're able to move around those ways of operating based on our assessment of what's going on. Trauma enters the picture. Again, trauma is not about the specific experience. Trauma is about the way that we've responded to experience, how that response pattern has been synthesized into our mind and body, our nervous system, and then how that response continues to present itself in the present. And so trauma, I think EMDR training refers to trauma as the past being present. And when that past is present over and over and over again, and we have a coping strategy or a response that doesn't line up to our actual circumstances, we have continued distress. And now we have a cycle that builds over time. Again, think about that Grand Canyon analogy, is that these patterns just continue to wrap around themselves. So as noted, the biggest stressor that we experience is generally related to other people. Okay, so our defense structures, our neurobiology, our personality is geared toward navigating how we view ourselves and how we view others in the world. Essentially, personality, the structure that builds around our survival mechanisms, it keeps us safe by helping us to avoid deep and meaningful connection with other people. It helps us to protect ourselves from being vulnerable, right? Increased vulnerability means increased chance to be hurt. I don't want to be hurt, so I'm going to protect that. The issue is that, again, it keeps us locked in a cycle of stress and fear response. And it also helps us, again, to avoid connection with others. And we know as well that connection with others, think back to tend and befriend, is that thing that helps us regulate most effectively. So we get locked into a very difficult space. And this space is where SUDS emerges, substance use disorders. This is where it emerges. This is the fertile territory where substance use issues crop up. We can go to the next slide. So substance use issues are the result of a maxed out system. We take a variety of factors, they build up over the course of a lifespan or over the course of generations. Think back to the mouse study. And substance use emerges as an extension of efforts to cope. Okay. This effort to cope enters the cycle and the pattern of stress response. And all of these functions continue to feed off each other over time. It brings us to a consideration of what's called a diathesis stress model. And that is degrees of predisposition, so think the mouse study, combined with stress, leads to an overflow. And it's at the point of overflow that, again, that's where the substance dependence has an opportunity to really take hold. Our role as practitioners, working with clients and working with families, is to identify the areas of stress or vulnerability that both require the most attention and where we also have the most opportunity to support actual change. Let's see, we can go to the next slide. This figure illustrates what's referred to as a window of tolerance. When a system is in a space, when our nervous system is in a space where we feel safe enough, we are, again, able to be flexible. We're able to experience the natural ebbs and flows and stressors of life. And we may be anxious and hypervigilant at times. We may feel disconnected at times, but overall, we spend enough time in the window of tolerance to engage effectively in the world. We're able to be in this space enough so that parts of our brain and nervous system that are responsible for learning, connecting, and integrating experience and memory have enough energy to actually do that. Again, what we see with substance use issues is that the substance use oftentimes acts to reinforce and or as an effort to alleviate people that are in hypervigilant, hyperaroused states, or disconnected, hypoaroused states. So an example of this, and these are correlations, but an example of this is that amphetamines reinforce a hyperaroused or hypervigilant state. They also may be used by somebody that's in a depressed, disconnected state as a way of moving out of that zone. So there's an association between the states of our nervous system and the function of substances that we often become dependent on. Another example would be something like a benzo, is that a benzo is an anxiety reliever, takes us out of our hypervigilant state. It helps us to disconnect. It's disinhibitory, right? So again, an interesting correlation there. Now we can move on to the family at this point. We can go to the next slide. This is I think number one, very cool, but also interesting photo taken of a reef or a small island emerging out of the Pacific Ocean. And this reef is emerging as the result of volcanic activity. The reef and the smoke is analogous to the substance use disorder. It's the thing that rises above the surface and oftentimes demands our attention. And again, our question is, where does this emerge from? And if we go to the next slide, we see that this small reef is not an island unto itself. So what may seem like separate islands rising above the surface are actually connected deep below. And this small reef rising above the surface is part of a vast chain that has been active and interconnected for a very, very long time and is deeply rooted in an interconnected process. So we can go to the next slide. And the idea of the volcanic island chain is the analogy to the family. So the single island popping up above the surface is the substance use disorder or the identified client that ends up in treatment. demands our attention. The family is the island chain where all these parts are interconnected and linked. And again, the elements that we end up looking at as needing treatment are things that have been building for many, many, many years, many, many, many generations, and have been reinforcing themselves over time. Another element in this chart I think that's helpful is that the family is at the center of this biopsychosocial model. And if we think about some of the topics that we've considered thus far, the family is the hub. So if we talk about genes, we're talking about heredity and family. If we're talking about coping strategies and roles, we're talking about learned behaviors and coping mechanisms from family. If we're talking about attachment considerations and relational patterns, we're talking about family. These connections continue. So what do we do with this? Much of what we've talked about above relates to how we evolve and adapt to our experience. And so just as we adapt to stressful survival-based experience, we can adapt to experience that supports connection, engagement with others, and openness. It's not this ability to learn and develop does not go one way. It is not only the identified substance user or client that is coping with stress. The whole system is coping with stress. If we have somebody presenting for treatment, that whole system in one way or another is most likely maxed out. So as much as possible, knowing that, as much as possible, we should endeavor to work and engage with the family. And we want to do that via a system approach, individually, whatever we can. The bottom line is taking the information that we've outlined thus far and using it to reinforce what we know, which is engaging a family system, engaging members of a system is effective. And we'll go over, or the final slide will be some studies that kind of back that up. In terms of the therapeutic realm, the family realm, the recovery process, our day-to-day efforts, I can't flip a switch and change the expression of a gene. I can't flip a switch and change somebody's neurocircuitry. What we can do, and what we know is helpful, is supporting people in developing insight, understanding, and motivation to engage differently in their lives and to engage differently in the world. Our role in the treatment process is to support individuals and assist them in rerouting a river. Again, like that Grand Canyon analogy. It's difficult, hard work. It's not a switch. But to do this and to be as effective as possible, again, strengthen numbers. Never underestimate the power of a group. It's self-evident that we should engage with members of a system, and at the very least, make sure that we're assessing family system considerations around how to better understand what's going on with our individual client. Because our individual client, their difficulties have not happened in a vacuum. It's not that single island just emerging out of nowhere. To take a look at what is actually helpful, or what may be most helpful to get us started in terms of family work. And I think we can go to the next slide. Yep. So generally speaking, systems work to maintain homeostasis or a balance. And it doesn't really matter whether that balance is quote unquote healthy or unhealthy. whether it's associated with nice feelings or stressful feelings, we like familiarity first and foremost. The unfamiliar is a major stressor. So generally speaking, we will avoid the unfamiliar for the familiar. By the time a person has entered treatment, again, these patterns have been at play for a long time. Oh, I lost myself here a little bit. So the single factor efforts to isolate and focus only on the identified client or substance use person, substance user, et cetera, substance dependent person. It's like looking at that island picture and saying, well, maybe we'll pile enough sand on top of this and we'll be okay. And so that will work for a period of time, but eventually that issue is going to reemerge. See that over and over and over again. So the change and to engage with families, individual family members should focus primarily on, very simply, doing their own work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know that support groups are helpful. We know that psychoeducation is helpful. We know that therapy and counseling is helpful. We know that coaching is helpful. We don't have to create something brand new and different. Our goal here is to support engagement. If we've done that, and if we can do that, we're ahead of the curve. Okay. So we want to support, if possible, looking at our own family of origin. We want to look at, just like we're supporting the identified client or substance user, how did this shape my sense of self, the way that I respond to emotions and stress, my own personality formation, the roles that I play in a system. And we want to use this to take a look at boundary considerations. Boundaries are not one size fits all. Boundary development is very nuanced and individualized. And it should be ideally based on an understanding of family history, roles, personality function. For example, a person that regulates stress and anxiety via criticism and efforts to control, they might not be the best candidate to look at how to set a hardline boundary. If anything, we want to support them in potentially taking a step back. Conversely, a person that has a pattern of being overly responsible for the emotions of others and avoids appropriately asserting themselves, right? They're somebody that we want to maybe support taking a more concrete step forward. Regardless, when we're talking about supporting these types of change, stress will be elicited because we're pushing up against the go-to coping strategies of the individuals in the system. The system is going to be stressed when individual members start to make change, again, because homeostasis and balance is going to be questioned at that point. But that is the biggest point of clinical opportunity. Okay, so there is where we have the chance to step in and to support people in making really meaningful changes that oftentimes can be connected to their own family of origin experience. And we can support people in working through meeting unmet needs and ultimately changing patterns and dynamics that have been going on for generations, consciously or not. I think that we're probably coming up pretty close to our time, so we can go to the next page here. This is a list of research and studies that generally supports practical benefit of family system engagement in a recovery effort. The biggest takeaway, again, that I just want to reiterate, it's nothing earth-shattering. It's not rocket science. It's that family member or family system engagement should be considered as important as work with an identified client. And essentially, we miss an opportunity when we don't have a chance or we don't make the effort to engage with the system. That's not always going to be, it's not always going to be the best fit. Some systems, the work is going to be about maybe developing boundaries where we're not as engaged with the system. But that effort and that perspective is ultimately beneficial to be reinforced and be practiced. And I do believe that it will be, and it is, as evidenced by these studies, of benefit to outcomes in general. So thank you again to everybody for coming out. I hope that my ramblings were somewhat helpful. And I appreciate, again, everybody's time and for the invite to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. We'll now answer some of the questions that were submitted through the registration process and during today's program. We will follow up with any questions we don't have time to answer. First, what are some strategies for family of a person struggling with substance use disorder when the family members do not feel like they are part of the issue and only want their loved ones fixed?
So this is an issue that comes up very, very frequently. And for me, when these issues come up, they are immediately indicative of an issue system-wide. So if we have a substance use disorder happening, we have somebody, generally speaking, that is not doing well. There's probably some form of crisis occurring. And so if members of the system are avoiding that fact in one way or another, we're seeing an example of a coping strategy. Right? We're seeing an example of the way that the system or members of the system respond to stress and emotion. So if anything, the first thing is that it gives us information, it gives us data, it helps us to better understand the identified client. And from there, really can't overemphasize it, but continuing to do information gathering. The more information, the more data that we have about an individual and a system and the history, the better able we are to identify the best points of intervention. And so data gathering, information gathering would really be the be all end all starting point. And from there, developing some ways of potentially approaching family system or family system members that may promote engagement or counter some avoidance.
Great. Can you revisit, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but can you revisit how families can be educated about the specific issues of addiction? Is it important they understand what addiction is and the effect on their loved ones?
Yeah, so I think we're really, really fortunate to have so many different options available for people that are interested in developing a better understanding. So what I would say is really anything, the more interpersonal, the better. So support groups, therapy, coaching, etc. Right? Al-Anon, Families Anonymous, therapists, group therapy, whatever, but interpersonal with other people. And I say this, so number one, information is power. Having an understanding supports self-awareness and supports insight. Self-awareness and insight support behavioral change. Okay. A difficulty is that when people start to Google, people will begin to gather information or find themselves reviewing information that ultimately reinforces a lot of how they're already feeling. So if we have somebody that's avoidant, let's say, and is non-assertive and is enabling and overly responsible for the emotions of other people, a lot of times you're gonna hear that person sharing an understanding of substance use issues and how to cope with that supports how they feel. So they're going to share information, they're going to find themselves reviewing information that reinforces a potentially problematic viewpoint. So again, the more that we can have an interpersonal factor, number one, the support connection. So tend and befriend, we know is a benefit, not just for the substance user, but for everybody, is number one. But also other people to basically hold us accountable, and that can know us and understand us and get some of our strengths and get some of our weaknesses and point that out, is going to be one of the most effective options. Saw in the notes, ACA, ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, another great support system, group program, etc.
Thanks. And I think this might be the last question, and we'll be sure to answer the other questions that came through that we didn't get a chance to answer. But how can a family develop boundaries while still being supportive, but not taken hostage?
That's where it's a great question. And that's where, for me, again, like number one, I come back to that assessment piece, is really, as much as possible, having an understanding of the players in that system and the personality function of the members of the family, so that we can really fine tune boundary development and approaches. Is that to be as effective as possible, we want to be as nuanced as possible, so that we're not setting somebody up for failure. One of the biggest things that I see people struggle with is that they shoot too high or they shoot too low. So they say, you do this, you're kicked out of the house. If you're not able to do that, if you're not able to hold that line, it's a big line, by the way, that I'm not promoting be used like across the board, just FYI. But that type of thing, if you're not able to hold it, don't do it. Don't put that out there. All that does is reinforces that your words aren't meaningful, perpetuates a cycle. So start with a small, sustainable boundary. A lot of my work is really, really, really trying to set people up for success and to support them in getting to a place where, despite difficulty historically setting boundaries, they're in a space where they're coming up with something themselves that they can put out there and that can be sustainable when challenged. So always anticipate that the boundary is going to be challenged. Again, we don't like change. So if we try to initiate change, expect pushback, expect that to elicit a spike in anxiety and stress and a behavioral response. And then our work is in navigating our stress and our anxiety and our emotions, holding that line. But we want to feel good about that line. Right? We don't want to be questioning ourselves in that space as much as possible.
Great. Thank you again, Alex, for your informative presentation. Everyone enjoyed it, and all of our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, the presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Watch your email for a link from cego.com to complete your evaluation. Once you complete your evaluation, you will have access to your certificate of completion. I'd also like to remind you that the slides and the recording of the webinar will be emailed to you within 14 days of the program, to the email that you registered with.
Great.
Karen, Encore, and Mark have several exciting events in the works. On Friday, November 4th, Karen is hosting a research symposium. This event will be offered both virtually and in person in Wernersville, Pennsylvania, and will showcase the latest evidence-based practices, treatment models, and cutting-edge research, helping bridge the gap between practice and research to improve the care of those suffering from substance use disorders. On November 17th, 2022, from 6 to 8 p.m., Mark will be co-hosting a lecture on family systems alongside Ashley Treatment Center, Ashley Addiction Treatment, with therapist Ryan Delaney, LCPC, presenting. On Saturday, December 3rd, Encore will be hosting an event in person at their Arlington, Virginia office. They will offer an education program for adult members of families called Strategies for Family Recovery, and a program for children and teens called the Untitled Children's and Teens Program. Karen and Mark also offer a joint weekly parent and family support group every Wednesday that happens virtually and in person at the Mark office in Towson, Maryland. Please check your email for more details. In the meantime, please reach out to representatives at Encore, Karen, or Mark at any time for additional information or questions regarding admission to any Encore, Karen, or Mark's programs. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.